Hello everybody, welcome to the shop. On the operating table today we've got the broken half of the big end rod bearing for my 15 horsepower Pattin that's sitting over there. I have to braze these two halves together, so the first step is to melt the babbitt out so I can get the babbitt bearing out of the way. Then I can V the bronze and braze it. So to do that, firstly I'm going to degrease everything so it's nice and clean so it doesn't smoke or anything when I melt the babbitt off, and also it'll contaminate the babbitt less because you can reuse the babbitt. Now I'm just going to put it in this baking tray here to catch the babbitt, and then I'll peel the chunks out and save them for later. Okay, so I'm at my welding bench. That noise you hear is my fume hood, so sorry for the background noise there, but I'll just fire up the torch here. Nice neutral flame, I guess. I got a couple different tools. I got a screwdriver and a wire brush here to, I don't know what'll be the best to melt the babbitt off. Well, that's going pretty fast. So the nice thing about breaks like this, where the broken piece is all jagged and rough, is that it creates a perfect key, you might say, for everything to align back together perfectly. So once I V this out, I obviously won't V all the way through. I'll use the remaining rough part of the break to kind of key everything together, and it will greatly help me align everything to make sure that nothing gets out of whack when I brace it back together. Also, to assist in alignment, I'm going to be bolting it right onto the connecting rod itself. It'll be a perfect fixture to hold everything the way it should. So I'll just put some spacers here or just run some bolts through it, bolt it down nice and tight, and braze it right in place. So here it is, all V'd out. I V'd it a little bit deeper than I originally intended, but that's okay. There's still enough broken area there to help key it together. So before I braze this, I'm going to try to degrease this as best as I can, because this is a really porous casting. You can see in a lot of areas, like right here, there's porosity all over the place. And over the years, especially something this old, it's going to soak up a lot of oil. So I want to drive out as much oil as I can before I braze it, because as I'm brazing this, it's going to cook more oil out, and that's going to be impurities in the braze joint, and that's obviously going to weaken the joint, and it's going to make it harder to make the bronze flow the way it should. So I'm going to degrease this with some carburetor cleaner or something. Then I'm just going to keep it warm with the torch for a while, and hopefully that'll try to drive out some of the oil. I would consider putting this in my oven as well, but I don't want to bake a pie and have it taste like grease, so I think I'm just going to stick with the torch. So to illustrate my point of the oil in the castings, here's an example. Right there, that little dark spot, that's some oil seeping out. Right in the middle of the frame there's some more oil seeping out. There's some more there. So I'm all set and ready to go, ready to braze it. I have it bolted onto the connecting rod, and the connecting rod is securely fastened to my welding bench in a comfortable position. I just used the original bolts and some spacers to bolt down the cap in the proper position. Here's what I'm going to be using to braze it. Peterson number 2 high temp flux. It's like a sandy sort of material, and then some uncoated bronze rod. This particular material is made by Weld Coat. low fuming bronze. So a quick overview of what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to preheat this entire thing, especially this part of the connecting rod, because this is going to be a big heat sink. It's going to suck a lot of heat out of this connecting rod cap. So I'll preheat everything just till it's nice and warm, not burning hot, but just nice and warm. I will select one of these rods. Oh, another thing, you see I pulled these rods out in this fashion so I can easily, without really looking, grab another rod if I run out of rod. I don't have to go fiddling around here with gloves, I can just grab one. Anyway, I'll get a rod ready, then I'll heat the rod up with a torch just a little bit and dip it in the flux, and that'll allow the granules of flux to adhere. And then you put the fluxed rod into the joint along with a little bit of heat, and that'll cause the flux to melt off and cover the joint, and that'll help start cleaning and pre-fluxing the joint. You repeat that a couple times, dip the rod in flux again, and then start brazing. It's a similar process to welding with a torch, or perhaps welding with a TIG welder. I've never used a TIG though. But you just have the torch coming in this way, the rod coming in this way, and you just dab the rod as you go along with the torch. One more thing before I start. This is a little trick that I learned from another YouTuber, weldingtipsandtricks.com. Check them out if you're into TIG welding or stick welding. You might have a problem where you use up your rod and then you have a hard time advancing more rod out in front of your hand to continue feeding it into the braze joint. So what I learned, hold the rod like so between your first two fingers and in the crook of your thumb, and if you want to advance more rod out, you bend in your fingers and pinch the rod, let go with your thumb and pull out, grab with your thumb, pull your fingers back in, then pinch with your fingers, let go with your thumb, and you just repeat, and that allows you with one hand to advance the rod out or back in if you need to. Make sure to practice with gloves too. Well, there we are. I had a little bit of trouble in the beginning because I had chosen an undersized torch tip. I definitely underestimated how much heat this thing needed. I should have known, because this is a lot of material and it's also very conductive. Bronze, of course, or brass, whatever this is very conductive, so it's going to pull a lot of heat out from the joint. I did have a lot of trouble getting the base material to melt nicely. I think, like I've mentioned before, there's a lot of oil still soaked in here, which you're never ever going to get out. There's a lot of porosity. It's just an old casting that wasn't made very well to begin with. If this was a machined solid piece rather than a casting, it probably would have brazed a lot easier. But I was able to make it flow. Considering this is like my, I don't know, second braze joint of my life, I think I did pretty good. The one thing I had to learn on the fly was that when you're welding with an oxyacetylene torch, you want to heat up the joint enough that the joint starts to melt and become wet looking, and then you feed your rod in. But when you're brazing steel with a torch, you just want to get it hot and then feed your rod in, and then it'll wet in, kind of like solder and join. But when you're brazing brass has pretty much the same melting point as bronze, which is what you braze with. So you want to melt the base material, which is the bearing cap, just as if you were welding steel with a steel filler rod with a torch. You may already know that. I didn't. I had to figure it out on the fly. I was wondering why the bronze wasn't sticking, and I realized that the joint was too cool, so I put more heat into it until the joint looked wet. Then I fed in the rod, and of course just keep dipping it in flux. Every every time I dipped it in the puddle, I dipped it in the flux. And it turned out okay. I'm sure if you did a cross-section of this or an x-ray, it would be like a sponge, I'm sure. Lots of porosity. You could even see the porosity as you were brazing, or as I was brazing. But anyway, that's that. And since I preheated everything, I'm really not too worried about any cracks forming along that joint from expansion or contraction. I think it's all heated up the same way, and it's all going to contract and cool down the same way. So I'm just going to leave it here for a couple hours or however long it takes for it to cool off. And here we are with the finished product. I just ground off the excess, and I was pleased to see that it's pretty smooth looking, no porosity or anything. Of course, that's at the very top of the bead. Can't grind all the way through to see if there's porosity, obviously, but I think it turned out pretty well. I'm sure if I had to do this 10 or 20 times, I'd be a lot better at my 20th attempt rather than my first. But this just goes to show you, any garage hack mechanic like myself can braze. So don't be afraid to do it yourself if you have a repair that you need to do. The one last thing I have to do on this before I reinstall it on the rod is, I don't know if it was like this beforehand or if it warped while I was welding or brazing or what, but this surface here is not entirely flat. It's a little concave, and this surface here is a little bit convex. When the cap sits on the rod here, there's a little bit of daylight you can see through right about the middle, but you can't see it through the ends. And that'll be a problem because this side of the bearing is the side that gets all of the load when the engine is running. And if there's a little bit of a gap there, that means it's going to try to crunch that bearing shell and break it right at the same location. So I'm going to, I don't know, I'm either going to machine this flat or grind this flat or what. I don't really know what I'm going to do, but I'm going to make it so that it sits nice and flat the way it should. And then that will be peace of mind, and I know that this should not break again. Alright, well that about sums it up, everybody. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. I learned something myself. Got a little bit better at brazing. I really haven't done too much of this before, but the more I do it, the more I get better at it, and the same goes for you. So make sure to hit the subscribe button, hit the like button if you enjoy this, and I'm sure you did. And make sure to stay tuned for more and watch the progress on my engine, which, by the way, cylinder fell off. So stay tuned for more updates. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you next time.